Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Volksbühne. We are very pleased to host this year's Transmediale Symposium. I'm certain that you all have had 3 exciting festival days in the HKB and look forward to 2 more days of packed program at Volksbühne. This year's Transmediale is entitled End-to-End, Direct and Uninterrupted Exchange of Information. An evening at the theater is a real meeting place. People experience art together, which in turn is presented to them live by artists and idea end-to-end and experience. Our audience has the chance and the pleasure to be in touch with the artist and with each other. We have 2 directors here in Volksbühne who work a lot with digital media, create video art. Susanne Kennedy and Kai Boges. In this season, you could see the productions Ultraworld and Don't Be Evil, and you get information, more information outside. But Volksbühne is not only a place for theater pieces, also a place for other artistic genres, film, readings, art or music. And not only for artistic work, also for discussion, for social debates. A theater is a public space, a space of conflict. I thank you for your attention and pass the word to the artistic director of Transmediale, Christopher Ganser. Thank you very much.
Yeah, indeed, good morning, and thank you, Hadar, for this kind and welcoming words. And it is indeed exciting to be here, not for a night at the theater, but for 2 days at the theater, at the first time that Transmediale is here as a guest in the Volksbühne. So I'm very happy that this cooperation could work out. As mentioned, as you see on the screen, the title of this year's Transmediale is End-to-End. And this symposium will now follow up on many of the themes that many of you might have already discovered through the previous days' programs in the exhibition at Haus der Kultur in der Welt. So End-to-End, the title of this festival and this symposium, is taken from a principle of designing networked communication in a way so that as much power lies with the users, the ends of a network, rather than with the intermediary infrastructures. And according to the initial idea of the end-to-end argument, or the end-to-end principle, the network should actually be this kind of dumb, stupid carrier, neutrally transmitting information. And end-to-end in this sense stands for a form of network idealism, a belief in creating infrastructures for communication and exchange of information outside of state or commercial interests, with as few intermediaries, as few go-betweens as possible. This idea of disintermediation from power structures originally meant also no surveillance, no manipulation of information through decentralizing networks. As we probably are all aware, networks, and especially the internet, turned out rather differently if we think about how platform and surveillance capitalism dominate today the experience, the mediation, the description also of what once used to be the idea of decentralized networks for democratic exchange that supposedly empower the periphery and not only the center. And consequently, a focus on negative network effects are commonplace, or is commonplace today. Hate speech propaganda, algorithmic manipulation, online addiction, etc. This doesn't prompt me, or I think us at Transmediale this year, to by necessity bemoan this kind of loss of innocence again of network culture, but rather to ask also at the same time if maybe a certain idea of the network has in itself and also network cultures come to an end. And to be a bit less dramatic, to at least have reached a kind of turning point, where it's now more also the limitations rather than the endless possibilities of connection that are foregrounded when we talk or practice networks. This is, I think, we could also take as a potentially good thing, so that now in the age when digitalization to a large extent has already taken place, maybe we might return to the network with a more realistic and perhaps then also more politically potent vision of what can be achieved through networks and through the internet. So the festival theme does not only speculate or kind of map out limitations of networks as a cultural imaginary, for example, but also proposes the strange return of the network after this end, so to speak. And that is a strange return that only manifests itself after the network has become infrastructure and ever pervasive. So it means that the program is trying to both describe these limitations of networks, present artists and thinkers that either re-engage in the practice and design of networks, or perhaps even challenge and leave the network imaginary behind. You know, we have an exhibition at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt that lasts also for a whole month. I hope that still some of you that also came only for the symposium have time to see it. Because it's intimately tied to this engagement of re-engaging, for example, also historically, the so-called critical net cultures in Europe and with global connections from the 1990s and onwards, where there was this kind of strong civil engagement in independent spaces and DIY servers, for example. So this can, maybe we can see in hindsight, was a largely failed movement, but whose principles are also revisited, I think, today, for example, in the phenomenon that we also hear about here in the symposium of federated networks, where communities are creating and maintaining their own infrastructures, their own networks, away from the big platforms. And there's also this desire by different groups to disintermediate not only from platform capitalism, but also from the normative structures on the total public web. So creating the equivalent of safe spaces that allow members of society who don't feel safe on the total kind of digital public space, so to speak, to have a more intimate and direct form of communication. And these artist and activist practices revisit, in a way, the end-to-end principle, but from a different perspective, standing from more from the perspective of kind of a desire for these intimate and direct relations with other individuals, but also individuals and infrastructures. And these relations perhaps follow also kind of a more holistic ideal of taking control of whole processes from end to end, and also considering what is actually in between. And in this kind of, now it sounds very abstract, but in this kind of process of, let's say, communication and social organization, I think we should also ask, and I take this with us as a question for the symposium, to which and whose ends. And here I'm also thinking about the integration of, for example, artificial intelligence and the kind of hyper-automated network, where there is an increasingly, let's say, dark or opaque relation between humans and technological infrastructures, entanglements that require this rethinking of these relations, indeed from end to end, but where the end might be many, a multiverse even of ends. So in this expanding sense of end-to-end, many-to-many worlds, I think this theme also resonates with urgent issues such as climate change and the different social movements that are now also rejuvenating protest tactics and decentralized organizational structures, including also with an awareness of the need to create circular economies that include this rethinking of the ecologies of many worlds, human as well as non-human. Overall then, the symposium program today and tomorrow is following these thematics, calling for a rethinking of the relation between humans, technologies, and ecologies, and in that rethinking end-to-end and decentralization as many possible ends to ends, and with them also new beginnings that can take place through the internet or other technologies and models and imaginaries of sociality. I have to check for time, because now come to the boring, for me, information part. Okay, so the format, it's not boring actually, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty. So the format of this symposium will be a bit different from what some of the, perhaps here, veteran transmediale conference goers have experienced. It's a very intensive back-to-back programming here in the main hall. I mean, there are also things happening around the house, also in the Rote Salon. I'm not going to go into detail into that, but you have your program leaflets and can check that out. And whenever you need a break from the intensive programming here, you can go out to these sessions, or if there's something you're especially interested in. Some of those sessions also kind of relate back to, in a more detailed way, the discussions here. So the main format here is the end-to-end exchanges. In these sessions, we have 5 of them. Theorists, researchers, artists, activists will dig into these themes that I just outlined. And the format is always the same. 2 in-depth lectures, about half an hour, actually 25 minutes to be exact each. They take place under a common framework, and then followed by a 1 hour of discussion that includes always 2 to 3 respondents, where one of them always comes from the artist program in the festival, the exhibition, or other parts. The respondent role is kind of to be a further commentator from complementary fields in disciplines of art, research, and technology. You see here the first day already, to give a little overview. We're going to kick off now, after my intro, with the wheres and whens of networks, starting out with, now the names are not on, but Michelle M. Wright, who will kind of speak on a sort of reframing of the space-time of the internet from the point of view of the materialities and frictions that were often deemed to be absent from networks. In the second talk by Clemens Apprich, we will then dig more into the, let's say, early ideas of net culture knowledge production and sharing, and the notion of collaborative filtering, and how this might relate to today's algorithmic filtering of the increasingly automated network, as I was talking about. Ultimately, I think that the first session also deals with the politics of possibility, and with the respondents, we will go further into these aspects. The second exchange, starting at 3:30, is Empires and Ecologies of the Cloud with Ulysses Mejias and Mel Hogan. And we're going to go there deeper into the consequences of the platform model, kind of what came after the network in a way. And especially we're going to discuss there issues of data extraction and exploitation on a level of the user, as well as the level of ecology and how the environment is being colonized by these big data infrastructures. If we move all the way to 8 o'clock in the evening, we have the third exchange session, next to Devastation, the final event also of today in this room, with the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and also Matthew Fuller and Olga Goryunova. Stiegler is going to outline for us his Internation project, which addresses questions of ecology and politics, and how in the face of climate crisis, one can maybe build new translocal networks of activists, researchers, technologies, and politics. And we will also hear in that session from Olga and Matthew with their new project and book, Bleak Joys, which kind of sort of carves out a new existential, let's say, condition and aesthetics after ecological devastation. And on it continues in the second day. I will just now skip quickly through that. Maybe in the morning, introduction tomorrow, I have some time to make a few remarks, let's see. But it's going to begin at 11:30 with deplatformization and the ethics of exclusion. It's going to go into some of those federated networks that I was speaking about before, but also on a philosophical level, thinking about the exclusionary kind of, let's say, components also of such new networks. For the final exchange session tomorrow, we go into these more automated networks, as I was mentioning, and the neural network cultures. There's also a closing plenary discussion, which I don't know anything about how it will go, but I will be in it among others. And yeah, we'll see it when we get there. In between these sessions, and now I'm going to have to wrap up in 5 minutes, we have performance lectures. So it's not all these exchange sessions. There are a series of, let's say, more artistic, we're even going to have some actual theater. And these sessions relate thematically, extend, spin off from the topics of the exchanges. Today we have Olja Lialina coming up after the first exchange with Endtoend, peer-to-peer, my to me. At 6:30 we have double counting, the Autumn Oration by Cycles of Circulation. This is the more theatrical piece. And tomorrow, after the first exchange, Sad by Design by We Are Not Sick. And at the very end here at the Volksbühne, we have the special double bill, Future Worlds of Entanglement, which features one performance called Eternity Be Kind and a screening of Lawrence Leck's new feature film, Adol. They are both going into ends and beginnings in different ways and talking very much about these entanglements of human and non-human worlds. I hope to see you all there, of course. I want to mention that there is a book you can get which connects both this symposium and the exhibition. It's called The Eternal Network, like the exhibition, with the subtitle The Ends and Becomings of Network Culture, that I edited with, together with Inga Lux. And it features also contributions from all the curatorial advisors of the exhibition, and it's published through Institute of Network Cultures. There's very few copies still for sale available in print, but it's open access, it's free to download, and you can get it through our website and through the Institute of Network Cultures. Go back here. So I want to thank, finally, I want to thank the Institute of Network Culture for their collaboration for that, but I would further like to thank our funders, the Kulturstiftung des Bundes, as well for the symposium, especially also the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, the Federal Agency for Civic Education, and without their support, also this more extensive, intensive symposium program would not have been possible. I'd like to thank the whole Transmediale Festival I'm thanking the team who has worked so hard together, also now with Volksbühne for this final push after a week of already intensive program under rather extreme conditions. It's amazing. So, yeah, thanks, especially to Amelie Buchinger, who is doing the overall coordination of the symposium, Lane Peterson as her assistant and stage manager here, Adam Asnan. Thanks to the technicians of Serviu and Sibylle Kerlich, and of course the whole technicians of the Volksbühne. I ask you to bear with us that we are on a tight time schedule. Have patience if we have to cut things short, like cutting me short now, and that we often have to move on to the next event. Both the format and the venue is a first for us, so thank you in advance for your understanding. Now, to the wheres and whens and of networks. I'm simply now introducing the moderator, Diana McCarty. Diana lives and works in Berlin and has a long-time interest in radical feminism, a founding editor of the award-winning free artist radio Rebooted Femme, and she was also co-founder of the feminist mailing list, Faces L. And as a cyberpunk in the 90s, McCarty was active in Netzkultur, Netzkritik, working with Metaforum, Faces, NetArt, and of course also the NetTime mailing list. She's been active in hackerspaces here in Berlin, in Mikro FV, and also the project Prologue, New Feminism, New Europe. Her work revolves around art, gender, politics, and technology. She initiated also the exhibition at HKW, co-initiated Nervous Systems, Quantified Life, and the Social Question. She's a 2019-2020 fellow at BAC. And I'm very happy that she's moderating this first session. Please welcome Diana, and I wish you a great symposium. Thank you for listening.
So thank you, Christopher. And one thing I just have to say, it's nice to see transmediale back in the East. I'm sure many of you are new to Berlin and might not realize that the Volksbühne is actually a very important cultural space, is now, but was especially important before 1989. And as transmediale started in the East at Potterville, and then finally went to HKW, which is an important cultural space in the former West Berlin. It's nice to see transmediale sort of shift over that where and when of time that actually directly relates to the topic of the Endtoend festival, because it's about in that time post-89 that a lot of this network culture started sort of taking off. I'm going to just add a short note before I get into the actual theme, or I'll go. If you look at the conditions for networking, the sort of topic of the panel today, the wheres and whens of networks, how can the conditions for networking be rewritten after network idealism has been left behind? And so you'll hear from Clemens Apprich and Blackness scholar Michelle Wright, challenging the ideas that the internet exists outside time and space. And they will discuss network blind spots around race, class, and gender, and the microcontrol of algorithms. I want to go into something else. They will also look at sketching out the politics of possibility for our time on, with, and outside of networks. So I just have to mention a sort of my favorite example of the wheres and whens of networks. Actually starts a long time ago, and it's based on the Haitian Revolution just before the turn of the 18th century. And I'm thinking of the Lieutenant Sanité Belair, who was, when she was finally executed by the French, they say she didn't close her eyes. She refused to have her eyes covered. Now this was big news. It turned into the first refugee crisis in the US, with whites fleeing the new black, free and empowered black-controlled Haiti. So you had a lot of white refugees coming to the US, and of course talking about a black lady taking up arms. Of course this news traveled to France. And I think the way that that story traveled, if you imagine different tables across the American South, who heard which story, right? White people telling white people what had happened with black people doing things for black people. What did black people hear in those stories? And so how did those stories continue to carry on? Certainly Harriet Tubman would have heard of this. And the funny thing is, the Russian Revolution of 1905 that didn't work and inspired the Russian Revolution of 1917 was fueled by a lot of extremely interesting Bolshevik women, including, among others, Elena Stasova, who was very much influenced by Harriet Tubman. So this is something where I like to think about, how does information travel, how does meaning travel? And I have to say that these are where I see, it doesn't always have to be so militant, but this is where the politics of possibility can happen. So I think that's a kind of nice way to introduce Michelle M. Wright. And I think we're really, really lucky to have you here. Yeah, I mean, you've been here at ICI, so you know Berlin. You've been a fellow at the ICI Institute for Cultural Inquiry. Michelle is the August Baldwin Longstreet Professor of English at Emory University, and she teaches courses in race, gender, and sexuality in the Black and African diasporas. And I think it's an important note that she's really precise about needing more than just Black or just African diasporas. It's more complicated than that. She's the author of Becoming Black, Creating Identity in the African Diaspora, and The Physics of Blackness, Beyond the Middle Passage Epistemology. And she's the editor of a number of volumes on race, gender, and sexuality. And I'm not going to go through her whole entire biography. I would like to just introduce her to come up and give her talk, Blackness in Cyberspace Time, the Epiphenomenal Internet. So please, Michelle, come up and take the stage. Welcome, and yes, I'm looking forward.
Thank you for that introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers of Transmediale for inviting me. It's such an honor. And I want to talk to you today a little bit about the relationships between blackness, time, and technology. You know, almost as soon as the internet began to hit the public imagination in the United States, one of the first topics out was about blackness and the internet and blackness and technology. And as you might imagine, a lot of assumptions and a lot of stereotypes were functioning. Two of the most famous arguments come from Anthony Walton, well-known public scholar, who argued that the reason you don't see black people in technology is for the simple reason that technology has always served blackness badly. And the example he gave was the caravel, which of course was a faster ship that became slave trading ships to transport enslaved Africans to the United States, as well as the invention of the cotton gin, which gave a much-needed shot in the arm to slavery in the southern U.S. and the Caribbean, because of course it allowed for rapid production of cotton into clothing. And so with this, he argues, well, no surprise that black people hate technology. Now, the one thing, of course, he doesn't provide is any evidence that black people hate technology, but that doesn't stop him from making this grand argument. Another scholar who is probably known to some of you, Henry Louis Gates Jr., very famous at Harvard, also made an argument around this time. This was about 1996, 1997, where he wrote that black people are allowing technology to pass them by. And to a certain degree, perhaps it's a problem of access, but nonetheless, they need to jump on the bandwagon and educate themselves and get onto the internet and learn things. The world is a wonderful place. In both these cases, there was this very strange, bizarre assumption, one by a white male, the other by a black male, which was black people are not part of technology. Now, at the time after I had read these, I was just a tiny little professor and very enraged, and I wrote an article called Racism and Technology, in which I talked about all the different ways in which black people from all over the diaspora, black Africans, black Europeans, African Americans, have in fact always been involved with technology. And it was a very fiery piece and very self-righteous piece. My punishment now, of course, is having to live with that intense youthful energy in my old age. But one of the things that I really want to sort of launch off and talk about here is these bizarre assumptions that are made. Why would educated people automatically assume black people are outside of technology? Well, I want to argue that that may be in part due to the fact that the way that we think about time is antithetical to blackness. And what I mean specifically by that is we are almost always taught from the time we are small that time is linear, that time moves forward, and that force that is pushing time forward is progress. So we have this assumption that as the days go on, as the years go on, as the centuries pass by, we are, or at least we should be, more civilized and more progressive. And of course, I'm sure all of you listening to this right now would think, well, I don't believe that at all. I don't think things have gotten better. And yet at the same time, we still have these assumptions in our head. When we go to school, we assume each year we are 1 year smarter. When we hire someone, we want to know, well, how much time have you taken for your education and for your training? Because, well, somebody with 10 years experience is obviously going to be a much better hire than someone with 5 years experience. And some of this comes from a person who was also very well known to you, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who in his philosophy of history, Philosophie der Geschichte, makes this argument that in the West, you can see time moving forward progressively, and that is why white European men are now ready to take on their own self-rule, and they no longer need monarchies. However, he says, when you look at Africa, and mind you, Hegel had never been to Africa, that didn't stop him from commenting on it. He said that Africa stands outside of time, and just as one would not talk about the history of the tiger, so should we not talk about the history of the Negro. Now, if we take another German scholar, one who is a bit more amenable to us, Karl Marx, we nonetheless see this same notion of time. Even though Marx read it into a materialist dialectic, he nonetheless argued that certain nations are further ahead than other ones when it comes to developing certain forms of government and society. Revolutions haven't hit certain places yet because they are not yet readily developed. So you can see here this notion of a linear time immediately connected to the idea of blackness and the argument that time moves forward and it passes black people by. We are simply not in the flow of time. This notion of time is probably known to you as the linear progress narrative, and it correlates heavily with the discoveries made by one of the greatest, most famous physicists of the Western world, Sir Isaac Newton, and Newton's laws of motion and gravity, which I'm sure are well known to all of you, or at least should be well known to all of you. This idea that an object in motion remains at that velocity until it encounters an object of greater or lesser velocity. And an object not in motion will go into motion, of course, if it encounters an object that has the force to move it into that velocity. Now, Newton himself did not necessarily argue that time moves forward, but that was certainly what was taken up by the Enlightenment philosophers, because their sense was, this is magnificent. He has found equations that allow us not only to figure out what happened in the past, but also allows us to predict the future. Today, however, physicists argue that Newtonian physics only operate in a vacuum. In other words, Newton's equations cannot simply be applied to the world immediate around us because the world is simply too unpredictable. And as you also may know, when it comes to the subatomic level of physics, Newton's laws simply do not operate. What is so key, I think, to people's attraction and the ways that we are taught Newton and Hegel and Marx is this idea of being able to develop theories that we can plug into linear time, and in doing so transcend all notions of space and time. In other words, when we're seeking to build knowledge, it's not uncommon for us to be seeking a universal type of knowledge that applies to everyone. Now, in Black academics, we also use linear time, and I would argue much to our detriment, which is what I make a much more elaborate argument for in Physics of Blackness, where I talk about how we quite often produce blackness through linear time by arguing that, for example, the African diaspora begins with the slave trade. And then we see a linear movement from West Africa to the United States, ignoring the histories that, in fact, the majority of slave ships stopped off in Europe first, before moving to primarily Central and South America, and then the Caribbean and the Southern United States. So we have this notion that African Americans actually embody an authentic blackness, and you will also find this notion about blackness on the internet. When you start trying to do research on blacks in the diaspora, two groups are going to come up first and foremost. You are going to get African Americans, and then you are going to get Black Africans, whereas the hundreds of millions of people who do not come from those spaces are rarely put into these major search engines and these places for further study on websites. Physics now argues that if time is anything, time is entropy. Time is ice melting. Time is a person growing. Time is a tree growing. Time is, in short, your atoms and molecules moving out to greater and greater spaces into moments of less and less order and what we call greater and greater chaos, but we don't necessarily need to think of it as chaos. Nonetheless, it makes sense to think about time as something that moves outward rather than sticking on this linear line. I play with this notion of entropy to think about time in a slightly other way, epiphenomenal time. I actually believe that there are probably many different theories of time, and time is probably a concept that we only poorly understand. And it may, in fact, be made of many other components. But I want to argue that we can use epiphenomenal time to start correcting some of these inaccuracies and move us away from linear time when linear time does not serve us. Now, when I was first coming up with these ideas, my thought was, get away with linear time. It doesn't seem to exist. We don't move forward. We don't move in a straight line. It's ridiculous to try and track a collective of people through one dot and say, this is their fixed origin, and now we can see them moving through history quite easily and neatly. And yet at the same time, I later realized that it's not unlike driving. When you're driving, you have to operate in two modes of time. On one level, because you are constantly in motion, you have to imagine an invisible line ahead of you that you are always moving toward. You can't simply drive from the moment where you are, because by the time you've adjusted to it, you've already moved into a different space, quite literally. Of course, you also have to be aware of your immediate surroundings, the now. And this is what I call epiphenomenal time, which is simply very phenomenological. Time is simply this moment. The past is not past. It's not located in some other place that we might be able to access one day through time-traveling machines. The past is, as you all know, and as Diane actually just pointed out, all around us, simply in changed form. All the people that lived before, all the buildings that lived before, the documents, the clothing, etc., they didn't simply poof into air. They were material things, and they eventually changed into other things after they were found no longer useful or simply dead. And the past, the present, and the future are all of one piece. Because if I try to explain to you right now what the present is, I say the present is this moment in time, but not this moment in time where I was just talking about the present, because that moment's already passed. I mean this time right now, but not this time right now, because that time is already passed. In other words, we are constantly in motion, whether it is our hearts pumping blood through our bodies, whether it is the earth spinning on its axis. There is never that stillness that is meant to define the present. So in other words, in the epiphenomenal now, all tenses of time are present, and that means we are responsible for all of them in that moment. So when I think about blackness and the internet and needing to use epiphenomenal time, these are some of the things I mean. Quite often, if you want to do research on blackness on the web, you have to ask yourself in epiphenomenal time, as you locate yourself, what is it I am asking? Where and when am I? Because blackness is not a what, it is a where and a when. In other words, it changes its form depending on the context. If you type black into the internet, of course, one of the first things that will happen, as all of us learned as young professors, is if you type black women into the internet, you're going to get porn sites. You're not going to get a lot about black women until you page through the first 200 pages. But just using that term black means that you are probably going to get more sites that speak to an African-American definition of blackness, that understand blackness as always already informed by a particular history of slavery, that it's moved into the universal, and that because that timeline produces Africa as our origin and the West as where we were transported, as you know, timelines also organize space. So Africa becomes locked into the past as that part of our timeline, whereas the West is meant to be the future. If you are interested, for example, in researching Black Europeans, if you use the term Black European, some of my work will show up, but you will also get a lot of African American scholarship on it, as opposed to getting Afro-European perspectives. So when you are using that where and when of the internet and locating yourself and finding these different websites, I would argue it makes sense to put epiphenomenal time as a question toward it. In other words, we have to look at it and ask, what sort of information am I being given here? Is it more of a linear sense? Does it assume that the Black collective is homogeneous? Does it attempt to give me a universal history, much less a universal notion of space and time and blackness that transcends certain types of contexts? Or am I being given another body of knowledge that the internet also offers? Afropeans are very active on the internet. It is not difficult to find them once you start asking what you are looking for and questioning what you are finding. With that where and when plugged in, you are able to start coming into connections with individual blogs in which people talk about the where and when of their blackness, where they are located and where they are going to and how they are moving outward. But regardless, no matter what the type of knowledge that you are coalescing, it's important to understand it as true in this context for now, in this where and when. We shouldn't attempt to take these notions of blackness and place them into something universal. One of the modalities that I move against most is what I call the middle passage epistemology. And what I mean by this is, an epistemology, of course, is a narrative of knowledge, and it asks, how do I know that I am black? How do we define blackness? In this middle passage epistemology, all time begins with Africa and that movement of the Atlantic slave trade, which we also call the Middle Passage, which comes from a nautical term that moves us into the US. And what we do in this middle passage epistemology, this linear timeline, is we start placing certain historical events on it to mark our progress or our lack thereof. So, for example, we have the end of slavery, which is a move forward. And then we have Southern laws coming in that relegate blackness to second-class citizenship. So we move backwards. Then we move to civil rights. We move forward again, and so on and so on. One striking thing about being a minority using linear time, in other words, if you're producing an epistemology that is not reproduced in majority epistemologies or is translated differently, something very interesting happens. You are not the agent of your own history. You are an object of history that is moved about by white dynamism. In other words, this linear time for minorities can radically distort the nature of who we are and what we do. Because we begin in Africa being, quote unquote, kidnapped and enslaved, transported by whiteness to the United States, enslaved by whiteness. We fight against whiteness, we lose against whiteness, and so the constant struggle goes. One way to break out of this through epiphenomenal time is to locate oneself on that timeline in a way that is much more diasporic. I think there are all sorts of different ways we can do this, and depending on your where and when, you can choose historical moments, but you can actually start with time and then move to something such as World War II. World War II, if you watch the History Channel, which I know you have here, can lead you to believe that World War II is simply all about Hitler and the American allies and sometimes the Japanese. In other words, the world becomes crunched down to 3 different groups of people and that's it. But World War II was truly a dynamic global war. And in it, you see blackness across the globe operating in a broad variety of different ways and all sorts of wheres and whens. World War II helps explain certain formations of blackness in Germany. In this now, we can see black Germans coming through World War I, through the tirailleurs sénégalais, through World War II with African American and black British soldiers, but we also understand that they come from an earlier timeline as well, as West African businessmen, law students, scholars came to German universities to study. Artists and activists also began to enter Germany in the 19th century. And of course, now we are dealing with even more complex forms of immigration and migration. Migration within Europe, with different Afropeans coming into places like Berlin, and migration from sometimes actually the United States and the Caribbean, but most often West Africa. In other words, when we take World War II as our timeline, and we simply understand it as entropic or epiphenomenal, we can see ourselves moving out and producing a dizzying variety of blacknesses. Now, when one tries to track that through the web, you're going to hit all sorts of interesting linear, vertical, hierarchical problems. Beginning with the fact that if you start trying to talk about World War II in Africa, you get the Africa Corps coming up. You get Africa automatically moved to an inert landscape on which Europeans were fighting. So again, what one has to do is ask, exactly what am I seeking and what am I looking for? When I had to do research on Africa and World War II, I hit this problem going into the archives, going through the catalogs, going through the internet, and finding this vertical hierarchization. My specific question was, what were African women doing during World War II? Because with all the information that we have on this period, they are almost completely invisible. One finds, at best, I think, the chapter in one book and a couple of essays, and that's it. And we are talking, of course, about hundreds of millions of people. I had to change the question in that where and when, and think about the fact that African women were not necessarily going through their lives asking themselves, what am I doing right now during World War II as an African woman? That was not how they were defining themselves. That is not their where and when. So instead, I had to take the tack of assuming they exist, they are there, they are going to work, they are producing. And of course, sure enough, I began to find them in colonial records, in migration records, and then was actually able to track their voices. But this, of course, is another problem about time that we have to face in the diaspora when we talk about the colonial and post-colonial and the pre-colonial. Those are times very heavily formed by gender. It simply tells you what color of man was in charge at the time. Pre-colonial means it was a man of color. Colonial means it was a white male, and post-colonial means we're back to men of color, and of course white men pulling the strings in all sorts of economic ways. So when we start rethinking how to interpolate blackness, how to interpolate a broad and dizzying diversity of blacknesses, from queers to black women to Afropeans, etc., we have to ground ourselves in that where and when and ask ourselves, why am I asking this question? What am I seeking? And how are the terms I'm using actually perhaps possibly more linear than they are truly epiphenomenal? Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Michelle. And unfortunately, we are not running on epiphenomenal time here. So yeah, we've got to get back into it. So I'm very happy to invite Clemens Apprich up to the stage. He's going to give a talk, Haunted Futures, Network Culture and Collaborative Filtering. And Clemens is an assistant professor in media studies at the University of Groningen and permanent fellow at the Center for Digital Cultures at Leuphana University of Lüneburg. He is also an associated member of the Digital Democracies Group at Simon Fraser University and of the Global Emergent Media Lab at Concordia University. All of these interconnected things are kind of hard to speak out. And of course, of the research, so it's a connection between those places and the Research College at Potsdam University. His current research deals with filter algorithms and their application in data analysis, as well as machine learning methods. And Apprich is the author of Technotopia, a media genealogy of net cultures, and together with Wendy Chan, Hito Styrel, and Florian Kramer, he co-authored Pattern Discrimination, which is fantastic. So Clemens, I would love to invite you. You're I didn't see you up here. Okay. That's how he's haunting the future. Thank you so much.
All right, 1 second. Let's try this. No, it won't show up. Ah, here it is. Okay, sorry for that. Thanks, Diana. Also, thanks for the lovely talk, Michelle. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but I think I'm also talking about this nonlinear times, like in a different perspective, I say. And I want to start actually with a quite recent and very local story, which you might have heard about if you're living in Berlin. So in September 2018, the City Council passed a new digitization strategy for Berlin. What's so delicate about this is that the project management was actually delegated to Ernst & Young. I don't know if you know, but Berlin has, like a red, green government, so it's kind of an astonishing move. But, Ernst & Young would be like one of the biggest accounting firms in the world. This, of course, has caused some controversy, in particular regarding Ernst & Young's focus, or sole focus, I would say, on economic and business development. So in order to accompany this process critically, the Digital City Alliance Berlin was founded in June 2019. Itself a network of stakeholders of civil society, science, and politics. And end of last year, a first public meeting was held at the newly established City Lab to discuss the question, what kind of digital city do we want to live in? Now, what those stakeholders don't know, or at least I haven't seen any kind of references or information of one of the websites, is that more than 20 years ago, a digital city already existed in Berlin. It ran under the glitzy name Internationale Stadt Berlin, the International City Berlin. And some of the people who were actually involved in Internationale Stadt and its projects are also involved in the Transmediale this year. So for those of you who have been to the exhibition who want to go, there's like also an installation called Clubnets. And some of those actually might be even here. I know that Diana was also involved, so please stop me, if what I'm saying is wrong or utter bullshit, so yeah. But I think the basic facts are rather uncontroversial. Internationale Stadt was founded in the mid-90s and provided an infrastructure for self-managed art and cultural projects. And at the heart of this, they called themselves a social architecture, was a back then quite innovative interface. Initially called the Bone, the interface was developed into a kind of shell system with each layer representing a thematic area. I'm trying out if this works. If not, we switch back. Let's see if you can see this. Oh, yeah. So this is kind of a web reinstallation, if you want, and it's very nice to navigate. It's like a typically 90s feeling if you feel this kind of media archaeology for websites. You have the different kind of areas like media, right? The different text, art, music, and you can really navigate almost the whole content of the Internationale Stadt. So the roughly 300 users of Internationale Stadt Berlin could navigate through these thematic areas and explore, and this quote is actually from the old website, explore the local structure with digital clubs, newspapers, galleries, and many other information resources within the global world of the internet. So despite the efforts to connect the local and the global space, the digital city ultimately remained bound to its local context. And that actually had the effect that the commercial internet providers soon superseded the independent initiative. The attempt to position projects like Internationale Stadt Berlin beyond the commercial media sector eventually failed. And also Christopher hinted to this kind of like failure. But maybe despite this failure, the example of digital cities in the 90s, and in addition to Berlin, there existed also the quite prominent digital cities like in Amsterdam, of course, but also Kiev, Vienna, and other European cities. So these examples give us some idea how the digital space was imagined and produced in the early days of the internet. However, the question remains why the city became such a prominent metaphor to represent this space as a space of socio-technical networking. So as Walter Benjamin already noted in the 1930s, new technological developments always steer our cultural imagination. Yet this imagination is not detached from our past. We collectively dream of a future where the old is suspended in the new. And I think this is also like one of these, another white male theorist in this lineage, but also somebody who would think about nonlinear time in different ways, as he calls it like an Echtzeit, right? For example, he has this example that the car was first called like a horseless carriage, and the radio was called the wireless telegraph. And I want to say that the same actually happened to the internet, or with the internet in the 90s. While electronic machines, for most of the time, had been understood as a mere instrument, as some kind of like extension of the human body, the power of digital network computers arose from their capacity to build an environment, some kind of like space to be explored. And as a consequence, architectural knowledge from actual cities was used to help navigate this kind of like newly built cyberspace, as it was called back then. The city, with its organizing principles, proved to be a very useful image that provided familiar concepts to grasp also this kind of new environment. Because the elements of the city, you know, the district, like the neighborhood, the block, but actually maybe also like the building, were seen as an ideal source for metaphors to describe enclosed spaces and access control. So this is very important, that it was some kind of like enclosed information container. And books that are, of course, now canonical are like William Mitchell's City of Bits, but also like Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City. So using this existing knowledge about its structured environment, the city provided some kind of symbolic order, you could say, for the new information space. And this did not only happen in North America, but also like plenty of examples like in Europe, like Christa Ma and Florian Rötzer's book, Virtual Cities, or the series like Telepolis, which ran from October to November 1995, was organized also by Florian Rötzer and Armin Medosch, and which then eventually led also to the foundation of the online magazine Telepolis. So this whole cyber discourse drew on a variety of concepts from modernist architecture, where the city is characterized as by a kind of like organizational regime of inclusion and exclusion. And this binary logic of inclusion and exclusion, of what to include and what to exclude, I want to argue, is crucial to what networks have become in the last 30 years, and more on this later. It is fair to say that the city itself has always been characterized by information, communication, and transportation networks. However, with the mass distribution of computer-based networks since the 90s, the city as a network has undergone a kind of like fundamental change. As Manuel Castells describes in his like 3-volume work on the information age, this process has been driven by the increasing dominance of what he calls a new space of flows, over or dominating the kind of like traditional space of places. Now, as digital networks became more and more interconnected with physical space, the idea of this kind of like an homogeneous information space was no longer sufficient to describe the increasingly complex network sphere. And instead of the city, the network as such was employed to describe data space and to tackle what Frederick Jameson had identified as this kind of like postmodern confusion. This confusion was caused by a quote from Jameson, "The incapacity of our minds to map the great global multinational and decentered communication network in which we find ourselves caught as individual subjects." So we really caught at this kind of transition, like a new paradigm emerged. The open, multi-noded, but maybe also confusing network instead of this kind of enclosed information system as it was represented by the city. Now, as I said before, what's characteristic of the 90s discourse about digital networks is that they were not only seen as this kind of technical medium or media or as mere instruments, but also as a social environment, yielding new forms of cultural production, communication, organization, and for some, even some kind of like new way of life. Not only was the idea of the network considered to bring some clarity into the postmodern world, but it also resonated very much with the socioeconomic shift of that time. As Wendy Chun noted in her last book, networks have been central to the emergence, management, and imaginary of neoliberalism. in particular to its narrative that individuals or of individuals collectively dissolving society. In other words, individuals would no longer be governed by means of social institutions such as parties, unions, or state organizations, but rather through this idea of a self-managed and self-organized network. Now, at the risk of getting into hot water here, I want to argue that this anti-institutional approach can in fact be seen as some kind of like common ground between otherwise very competing ideas of the internet during the 90s and early 2000s. On the one hand, you know, the Californian ideology represented by Wired magazine, for example, and on the other hand, critical net cultures, which have emerged in the same kind of milieu as the digital cities in Amsterdam, Berlin, or Vienna. And there's also, like on the exhibition, a very nice video about one of the conference of technical media, Next 5 Minutes, where John Perry Barlow, so one of these, you know, Californian ideology partisan, I would say, is also talking to some of the people of net culture, or critical net cultures. In their anger against governments and businesses, but also due maybe to frustrations with old left hierarchies, these net cultures eventually help to promote the network model, believing that the implementation of network technologies would help to dissolve the old power structures and enhance democracy, and also like bringing something that Christopher mentioned in the introduction, something like a network idealism. And NetTime itself, I know it's more complicated and this kind of like varies because there are a lot of debates within NetTime, and also in the exhibition, like the whole kind of like, you know, mailing list is printed out in one book and many others, like Faces and Rhizome, so you can read this. But NetTime also had this idea, and it's like even written on the website, but also the book. NetTime describes itself as a self-organizing process of collaborative text filtering, and I want to like highlight that because I'm coming back to it. Now, this is not to say that critical net culture simply adopted Californian ideology. I mean, that would be stupid. But rather that the network model itself was able to absorb the critique directed against it and to incorporate it into its own model. With the effect that, and I quote Katja Diefenbach, the subversive promises given with regard to the network technologies got broken, while the network managed to assert itself as a dominant model of organization. So with the transition from cyberspace to a network space, the internet actually moved away from an infrastructure project, as it was like seen in different kind of like bills and so on, as a state-funded information superhighway in the 90s, towards something like more community-based and user-driven application, like also famously, you know, represented by Web 2.0 and social media and so on. However, the underlying logic of the network, I want to argue, is still haunted by the same city imaginary of the 90s. In particular, when you think of the central role the neighborhood plays in actually existing network culture today. The idea of the neighborhood, although in a very abstract sense, has become the driving force behind most of today's digital service industries, like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Spotify, but also like smaller data collection and analysis companies. So the data economy, or as Mel Hogan had this very nice term, the data industrial complex, in her talk at the McLuhan lecture, so this data industrial complex actually relies on neighborhood technologies to sift through an ever-increasing amount of data and extract fast-selling information from it. So what used to be a technique, and I find this quite astonishing, what used to be a critique within critical net cultures to collaboratively filter information from data, as we have seen with NetTime, has become a massively implemented and algorithmically enhanced system to calculate the user behavior on a statistical basis. So actually, maybe it wasn't a failure, right? It was just a big success, when you think about this technique. We see the use of collaborative filtering all around us. As a central part of recommender systems, collaborative filtering personalizes our web experience, telling us what to buy, which movies to watch, which songs to listen to, whom to be friends with, and even whom to date. Collaborative filtering leverages our shopping, watching, listening patterns, and predicts future behavior based on past data. But that's not all. The predictions about the user's behavior is based not only on the past behavior of this specific user, but also on the behavior of all the other users within a given network. We are constantly being lumped together in order to make predictions about our interests. And one of the standard methods to do so is known as neighborhood-based approach. So the idea for collaborative filtering comes from the belief that people often get the best recommendations from someone who is like them. So if a person A has the same interest in an issue or item as person B, A is more likely to share B's interest in a different issue or item than that of a randomly chosen person. You all know that, it's the famous kind of like Emerson slogan, right? People who buy X also buy Y. The assumption that people like things similar to other things they like, or the assumption is, sorry, that people like things similar to other things they like, and things that are liked by other people who are like them. So what matters is not so much the individual node, but the ties to other nodes. And I find this also very interesting because it goes completely against the ideology, of individualization and personalization. It's not about the individual user or the node, it's really about the whole network. You are what your neighbors are. Correlations are not solely based on your actions and history, but rather the history and actions of others like you. And this is, of course, what Wendy Chun and others have called also the homophilic principle of the network. But how is this like you being calculated? How can you even assess similarity? And don't worry, I'm not going too much into details here, but that's like my side project, trying to understand psychoanalysis and psychology and psychometrics. But one central component to collaborative filtering is called embeddings, which can be learned from existing data. And those of you who know a little bit about deep neural networks, you will see that an embedding is actually just a hidden layer you put on top of the input data. So using this data, embeddings map users or items to low-dimensional space in a way that similar users or items are close to each other. So we will see again this kind of principle of nearest neighbor in there. There are many mathematical techniques for capturing the important structure of a high-dimensional space in a low-dimensional space. However, two methods have proven to be very powerful when creating an embedding for machine learning systems. And these are principal component analysis and factor analysis. For a fact, they're very similar in many ways. So this is also why in statistics they're always being confused. There are fundamental difference, but I don't want to go into the details. You will have a hint if you see at the vectors and the kind of direction they're pointing to. What I want to argue or what I want to mention is here that the big advantage of factor analysis, so the one to the right, is that I don't have to explicitly ask the user about a specific aspect about her life. But I can easily measure it by collapsing a large number of variables, so these are these y's, y1, y2, and so on, into a few underlying factors, f. For example, a retailer may not be able to directly ask about the customer's class, gender, or race, although, of course, the marketing department is very much interested in this information. But instead, the retailer can measure the likelihood of these categories by combining a set of variables. So again, you combine the variables and try to find the underlying factors. And this brings me to the last point of my presentation. What all these models are ultimately trying to do or to achieve is to find patterns that can be applied to unseen data. I mean, that's the basic of any kind of machine learning. Again, machine learning is not some kind of crazy, mythical, I don't know, new religion. It's just a very basic understanding about what are the patterns, and then I take the pattern and apply it to unseen data. So that's the main point. In computing, this is called pattern discrimination, which describes the imposition of identity, so a pattern, on input data in order to filter, so to discriminate information from it. And discriminare, so the Latin word, really means to separate, to distinguish, to make a distinction. Now, these models do not operate in some kind of digital la-la land, but are actually processing real world, and that is our data. So it comes with no surprise that the patterns found in the data are actually same patterns that for centuries have produced discriminatory practices. And Michelle, you hinted this, there are a lot of course, recent publications hinting to this kind of like problem, right? Collaborative filtering is by no means a natural phenomenon. The collection and analysis, that is the production of data, is based on a framework of interpretation that is always presupposed. Because the patterns that are uncovered through network analysis are precisely those patterns that were assumed to be there from the beginning. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. With network analysis, so that is the assumption that similarity breeds connections, seemingly immutable categories such as race, class, and gender are embedded in less crude categories, zip codes, buying behavior, social credit scores, and so on, with the effect that the historically grown power relations are now hidden in this kind of like natural preference of individual users to only surround themselves with their peers. So the binary logic of the city I explained in the beginning is simply reversed. Not exclusion, but inclusion creates segregation. And this leads to this kind of like new essentialisms within network culture. So to be fair, the tremendous growth of data produced on the internet has made it much more difficult today to effectively extract information from it. The problem is not so much that these systems, or I think the problem is not so much that these systems help us to collaboratively filter information from an ever-increasing data stream, but that the underlying patterns, and again, these patterns are mainly informed by network analysis, correspond in so many ways to this kind of like retrograde identity politics. The binary network logic behind collaborative filtering, so that is behind actually almost any kind of internet platforms we know today, is truly haunted by its own past, thereby causing the much discussed classist, racist, sexist disparities in today's network culture. Now, this newly created algorithmic identity, I think, also opens up new possibilities, or new politics of possibility. As John Jenny Lippold has shown, collaborative filtering does not only determine a user's identity, but is also inflected by it. Each time a user moves from A to B, from one web page to another, the categories of identity are being updated. Hence, a user's ascribed gender, for example, can and may change as new data about this user is gathered. The algorithms initially built to help marketers to effectively target users with advertisement, content, and services allow maybe for this kind of like fluid identity formation, which transmutes with each cycle. And of course, the counter-argument would be again that this is the network model just incorporating its own critique, right? But the point, and maybe this is true, but the point I want to make here, or what I want to hint at, is that the idea that the datafied subject within the network doesn't necessarily constitute a stable state or identity. It is considered to be the never completed endpoint of collaborative filtering, and not, as it's like sold to us in some way, its starting point. Consequently, the individual user isn't simply the product of the network, but the network itself is constantly produced by its nodes. It is a social relation after all, and I think like scholars like Tiziana Terranova have really hinted at this for a long time now. In times when not only the neighborhood has entered collaborative filtering algorithms of today's online platforms, but these platforms are now reorganizing everyday urban life and thus change also our understanding of what the neighborhood is and how it works. I mean, platforms like Amazon, of course, Foodora, but also these new ones like nextdoor.org or nebenan.de or nachbarschaft.de. It might be maybe the time to recall the idea of this social architecture once cherished by the Internationale Stadt Berlin. And maybe this sounds naive, but in the spirit of early net cultures, I do see potential to reappropriate the notion of the network and to mess with these rather retrograde categories of current filtering systems. We could maybe also try to re-inhabit these technologies. However, also in regards to the 90s, we should maybe rethink the network without being constrained by the all too often limiting idea of the city and in particular its neighborhoods. I know that Felipe has also done a lot of work on this. and also to maybe rethink really the social and not necessarily the communal aspect within social networking. And for some reason, I don't know, but we can elaborate this now, I think this is also something about this diasporic understanding that we could bring into a network, which doesn't necessarily have to build on a communal node, but could be think about the potential opening, social aspect of the network. Thank you.
Clemens, thank you so much. Yes, I would like to invite the respondents, and I would like to say thank you, first of all, Clemens. I would like to invite Michelle M. Wright up to the stage, and Yvette Mutomba, and Julia Gross from Contemporary and Felipe Schmidt Fonseca. Please come up and take a seat. And yes, I wanted to say thanks a lot for that, and I think both Michelle and Clemens, what they pointed to is very much how the technologies we used are informed by cultural assumptions, and they look at how sort of the construction of identities is also furthered by technological developments. And it's sort of interesting for me to look at how the reproduction of imaginaries takes place on an actual technical basis. So like all of the things that people think about who could or would use something inform how it's built, how it's coded, and then inform who actually does use it, which again informs who can imagine using it and informs further recursions of that. So it's a kind of cultural feedback loop where cultural codes are coded into the code. Yeah, a never-ending loop, but can we break out of it? So, okay, it's more comfortable over here. So, I think we are going to start with Contemporary And as a respondent. And Contemporary And is an art magazine, and it's a dynamic space for issues and information on contemporary art and from Africa and the global diaspora. They publish features, columns, reviews, and interviews in English and French. It's a fantastic, by the way, a fantastic endeavor, so congratulations. And twice a year, I say Contemporary And, it's often just C and, but yeah. I like the and because I think the and always implies that there's more than. It's the unknown more, right? So, and so this is, I think it's something you can find it on the interweb, so please check it out, and it does come out in print. So, I think we are starting with Yvette Mutomba, and she's one of the co-founders and editor-in-chief of the Contemporary And. She is currently a guest lecturer at the Institute of Art in Context here in Berlin at the Institute of Art in Context at the University of Arts. She was part of the curatorial team of the 10th Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art in 2018 and visiting professor for global discourses at the Academy of Media Arts Cologne. And yes, I'm not going to read through her whole biography because we are on the timeline we're on. So the stage is yours. No, Yvette, like.
Okay. Okay, so I just give my comment? Or I'm not sorry, I'm not really sure.
Okay, so as far as I know with this new format, which I quite like, is I think that you have a chance now to speak to both Clemens and Michelle and the talks that they gave from your perspective. Maybe, I think because now we're doing Contemporary And, should maybe you just both go? Then just give me a moment and I will have to properly introduce I'd say fantastic Julia Gross because we just worked together on a project and that was a lot of fun and it was great. So in Munich at the Friendly Confrontations. So Julia Gross is a Berlin-based journalist, art historian, and co-founder and editor-in-chief of the art magazine Contemporary And. She taught at the Leuphana University, where Clemens has also been, and she recently launched a critical panel format together with the German journalist and scientific historian Julia Voss. This is called The Situation. And until 2013, she worked as an arts correspondent in London for the FAS, SZ magazine, AD magazine, and Taz. That's a local Berlin paper, quite important. And I say this for our international guests, all really good stuff. She wrote and co-published several books, such as I Am Built Inside You, which I highly recommend reading. And her most recent book is Ein Leben lang, which is a lifelong. Yeah? And yes, and she is also currently guest lecturer at the Institute for Art in Context at the University of Art here in Berlin. Okay, that's the formal stuff. We will get to Felipe when it's your turn. Okay.
All right.
So I think, yeah, both of you are invited warmly to give your feedback or inputs or questions, comments, criticisms on the talks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to hear. Thanks to both of you. I think for me, I obviously first maybe can respond to your talk because I think it resonates very much with the work that we do. And I think this idea how the diaspora actually is more than this one linear narrative is very important part of our work. That is kind of daily this idea coming from certain categories we're dealing with, like for example this idea of African art that does not exist, or the idea of black art and certain aesthetics, because we are both coming from the visual arts and art history. So I think this really also ties into this idea how linearity is connected to specific narratives, also omissions in certain narratives, and of course that's also connected to time. I think you can also see that, for example, in the project we have in the Transmediale, the Center of Unfinished Business, where we have books that on the one hand side very specifically or directly respond to these ideas of what networks can be, but also bring in books that actually don't talk about it, and by that show the blanks. So we have books where in the first moment you maybe think, why is this book in here? It's just about art history in Europe and the Americas. It doesn't have anything to do with colonialism, for example, but of course it has everything to do with it, because it has this blank by not considering that there's actually other narratives beyond that. So maybe I just stop and you continue and then we go back and forth. So.
What I found interesting, I found both of your inputs super interesting, but Michelle, when you started with the initial question or this very problematic thesis, black people and technology, question mark, yeah? And because we've been working with, we started in 2013 and already then we've been working with young coders or from African cities, young artists from African cities working with coding or really early thoughts about cryptocurrencies and alternative formats, how to have a currency to strengthen certain neighborhoods, etc. The questions around black money and these kind of questions. And for us, it's so funny to see now these news of, oh, the Twitter boss has been to Africa, ooh, and he's so exciting, he's going to move there now, and because he's just found out there's so many hubs in Ethiopia and in Kenya, and this is something, of course, because we're not coming from the techie perspective, but we've been in African cities a lot and still are, and go back and forth, and have been working with these youngsters and people who do learn coding from an early age on, etc. So always these cliches or ideas where this kind of knowledge production is rooted, obviously in, I don't know, California or wherever, but not in anywhere in Africa. This is really funny that these guys have to come up now and saying, hey, actually I've been there for 2 months, it was amazing, and I'm moving there now. And this is always, I don't know, I don't know, why does it always, in terms of linear time, does it always take so long to, to come to this kind of knowledge, because it's there, we've been on this for several years now, but it's always funny that you need this major mainstream voice to tell the world, it's Africa is great, or they're doing, they know how to work with the internet or the computer, etc. So I found this very interesting. And maybe I don't know, just some quick words about what we're doing as the end. For us, it has always been important to really stupid straightforward to start as an online magazine, because obviously the distribution aspect has always been a key to us, that we can reach people literally all over the place. So a person in Accra as well as a person in Oslo or in New York. And so this idea of accessibility has, let's say, many levels. I'm looking at what we're doing at Contemporary, and first of all, as I said, the physical accessibility, but as well in terms of what kind of content we produce. It's quite focusing on visual arts in a wider sense, quite complex, but the key is that we don't, first of all, we have a pretty accessible language. It's not an academic magazine, so again, that ideally a 12-year-old person in Nairobi interested in art can consume it as well as you, for example, and don't get bored if you read it and think, this is kids language. It's not, it's quite complex what we're producing. And what we have as well, which is important to us, we don't have an in-house style in terms of how the articles sound. So not that if you've read one New York Times article, you know the sound of all of these articles because they have this particular in-house style. And from our perspective, it's important that you have writers all over the globe, literally, who come with their particular styles, which come from their particular cultural backgrounds. So someone in Harare has a different style writing about culture or contemporary art than someone from New York, for example. And we would never squeeze or style these kind of very different languages or aesthetics in order to have one homogenic, C-end language, something like this. Yeah.
And I think this really kind of ties also into this whole question around the networks, because for us, for example, as we don't write the text for the magazine, it is, in a way, the network who produces the content, because we work with a huge network of writers, but at the same time it's also not, because it's so diverse. It's, you can't say there is like one common interest, or it's like, of course, maybe there is somehow the sensitivity for visual arts, or like a certain kind of, sensibility for what's happening in Africa, the diaspora, but at the same time, and this is where, as you just said, comes the end from in contemporary, and at the same time there's so many other things, and this is really something we try to grasp on these different levels, like Julia said, with a different kind of writing styles, but also, but not necessarily talking about any geographies, but just by making, producing texts where people talk from their perspectives and their content, and so that it becomes clear that there are also these different networks that then come together and then spread out again. And performance artists in Sudan maybe has more in common with some performance artists in Oslo than in Johannesburg, so to also kind of counteract this idea that networks can be tied to specific geographies in that sense.
And maybe one last thing about accessibilities was as well, because we, as I said, don't come from a technical background, but had to learn very early, like 7 years ago, how different our content is accessed by people, and we realized, looking at analytics, that most of our content, or our content from especially African cities, has ever been consumed through smartphones, only phones. So we had to become responsible on a very, from our perspective, as I say, we're not techies, from a really early stage had to become responsive, so that we can be as accessible as we want it to be, so that people, I don't know, in Cairo, wherever can read the content on a normal basis, and because so many things on a smartphone are done in African cities, are done on a smartphone in African cities, like from banking, shopping, etc., which is normal in Germany now as well. But like 7 years ago, it was really rather abstract for us to think, okay, everything is done on the phone. So that was something we had to learn as well.
Yeah, I think I've got to carry on in the timeline, and so I'm We're going to continue having a conversation here, but I would like to introduce the third respondent, and that's Felipe. He is Felipe Schmidt Fonseca. And Felipe is a Brazilian activist and free advocate turned researcher, currently on the Open DOTT project as a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Dundee. And in the past 15 years, he's been a co-founder and leader of a number of community and networked initiatives dedicated to critical thinking and making in the crossroads of culture, science, technology, and society. And then I think you will know some of the projects, so Brico Labs, Lixo Electronico, Ciencia Alberta, Uba Tuba, and Uba Lab, along with many others. So Felipe, I'm going to give you the mic, and you have about 5 minutes, and then we will continue a discussion here.
Thanks. Sarava Ogun. Yeah, 5 minutes is too short, I think, because I guess precisely that crossroads between the experience in the city and how digital technologies influence the way we perceive the city, and on the other hand, how the city was used at some point as a metaphor to understand what were the possibilities of technologies, is one of the subjects that I'm very interested in, but also thinking about alternate time and other narratives that counter the perspective that we are progressing towards a better future. I think it has a lot to do with what we once expected of networks. And indeed, it was naive to think that networks could provide meaning after meaning was lost in the last, I don't know, 100, decades, centuries, millennia. But I think it's important also to challenge the very idea of the network being something that is on top of society, on top of the urban environment, on top of institutions, and it's something that happens differently after they were totally clogged or stopped. So instead of thinking of networks as a kind of post-development state or post-industrial state in which things will start to work again and democracy can be regained, I'd like to offer a different perspective that comes from my experience working with communities in Brazil, with neighborhoods in Brazil. And in a sense, networks have been there all the time, way before digital technologies existed. And people would have social bonds that went beyond the church they went, or the school they went, or the workplace. And these bonds were built not only out of affinity, that is every day more mapped and programmed, so affinity, the mechanisms to understand which kind of music I would like based on what I liked in the past and people who like similar music. But these networks that we see everywhere in communities in Brazil, they are born out so not only based on affinity, but also out of empathy. And this is kind of something that is very hard to map in machine learning environments. How do you predict empathy? And I hope it's not totally mappable. But I think that may be one way to understand networks, that we're there all the time. When it comes to my own particular experience in the city that I lived for the past 10 years until July of 2019, I was living in a smaller place by the coast in Brazil that had a lot of contemporary contradictions. So it was really on the border of the area that is impacted by oil production. And on the other hand, it's a city that still has more than 80% of preserved areas of the Atlantic rainforest that is otherwise almost destroying the rest of the country. And we were trying to use networks there as a way not to build on top of development, not to build on top of what the industrial era narrative, white, Western, industrialized version of history asked that city to become. So the common sense is that that city should first get rid of the trees, get rid of the natural areas, then start industrializing, allow heavy industries to develop there so as to produce, jobs for everybody. And what we were trying to do was using networks to bypass industrialization and try to come up with alternatives. And some small victories were achieved during that time, those 10 years that I was personally dedicated to that. But on the other hand, there was this whole other wave of political uses of networks, and that comes after, Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and the Trump election and what happened in Brazil in the elections. And the result is that everybody is leaving the country right now. So in a sense, if we think of networks as a sort of machine to skip the linear progression of time, a kind of hopeful time machine, I think this time machine is still working, but it's malfunctioning, and we should try to learn how to repair the potential time machine that networks can be in order to change society for the good. I'm really pessimistic right now, and I think it was, I am aligned with the kind of sense that I had from the transmediale exhibition, where we were discussing with friends after the opening. We started calling it like neo-pessimism. But I guess it's the spirit of the times. But I still think the amazing time machine that networks can still be repaired, and we can use them to leapfrog and to bypass all the parts of modernity and contemporaneity that we don't want to engage with.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So you want to reboot the system, and it's a wonderful segue into a minor correction. I was a simple user of the International Stadt Berlin, but I would like to say that Clubnetz itself, because Pit Schultz and Thomas Kollmann, who are also co-founders of Reboot FM, were very involved with International Stadt, and Clubnetz, which was bears a direct relationship on Reboot, although we made a lot of social adjustments in terms of modeling and because of learned blind spots. But I just have to appreciate the music comment, because when it comes back to how technologies are utilized and how they inform what happens, I think we should never forget in Berlin this connection between Berlin and Detroit, and how techno music, which was coming out of like a really, I think, a very strong black city with a lot of education and advanced use of technology, combined with this completely weirdos from Kraftwerk. So like Underground Resistance and the combination of their work and their connection, which was really funny to hear them talk about what it was like to send faxes, and basically like getting these like faxes which are like Underground Resistance. It's one black sheet of paper with a logo. So you use a lot of ink. But that's like pre-internet communication of a network that remains really vital. But it's also one of those things, it's like if someone mentions that black people don't like to use technology, it's an incredible, just blind spot, but deaf spot. Maybe it's too much bass, I don't know. But anyhow, I thought that's a nice way to look at how technologies get implemented. And I think going back to cities, because I want to ask both Clemens and Michelle a question, is that the datafication, like how does this, this like non-digital algorithm, or the collection of data informs how cities are formed. Like it's not just about your neighbors, it's how identities are constructed through the data collection and then implemented and enforced. And then how those things become how we can imagine who we know, right? Or how we can imagine who we could be. And so, because both of you are speaking to that, and then I would also, basically I would extend this question first to Clemens and Michelle and Clemens, I'll go in order, then to Contemporary and, both of you, to Yvette and Julia, and then again to Felipe. So, did you get that? How do the data collection informs what constructs identity, and how that then gets implemented in like social relations, not just through media, but outside of media, so via media, and then implemented in daily life?
It is on. It's just my voice that's the problem. I cannot speak terribly deeply to data collection beyond a lot of the critique that has come out of academe in terms of how data is or is not collected on black peoples. And you had already talked about the need to fill in the blanks, the ways in which knowledge is often, well, two different things about knowledge. One is the way certain knowledges, even once proven false are endlessly reproduced, and then how other knowledges, especially knowledges about minority groups that defy certain types of stereotypes, have to be continually reproduced because they evanesce, because they disappear, because they aren't accepted. And when it comes to data collection, I think that problem is still very much in place, because data, for the most part, is not really collected on minority, marginalized groups beyond ways to control them. They are not looked at as agents, and they are not looked at in terms of where and when they are, which goes back to what Clemens was talking about. So, in fact, a lot of data collection on minority groups is, it's a blank slate that is filled in with stereotypes rather than being informed by the sort of active production of those identities.
No, I'd say this is the point, right? There's no data collection, it's always data production. So that's like also this title of the book, right? The raw data is an oxymoron, because I mean, in the sense about it, when you think about at least this triangle, that's in my head somehow, but you have data, information, knowledge. We usually concentrate on this data and information aspect, but not the knowledge aspect. And this is where the patterns actually emerged. So as soon as you kind of like try to mine the data, you have a presumption about what this data should look like, and you make it, so there's no raw data, right? It's always like a presupposed thing. The interesting provocation, I think, is here, that came out of the book, and it's really like mind-boggling me a little bit, is this provocation is you cannot not discriminate. You cannot not filter. We were talking about this kind of like always filtering, right? Always be filtered. So that's also a provocation we have from computer science, because I mean, if you want to have information and not being lost in a paranoid deluge of data, you need to filter, and you need, but we are missing this third aspect, the level of knowledge, how these patterns actually emerging, right? I'm not against patterns, that's not the problem. I maybe even not about discrimination in a sense, but how can you discriminate without being discriminatory? And that's interesting also as a provocation, I guess, for an online magazine. You're also constantly filtering, right? So we have a lot of practices where you see these kind of things, how these are actually done. And this is something, I guess, especially in data science, computer science is missing. But again, and we had a lovely PhD workshop, it's not only the critical humanities, you know, the data science have to make one step towards the critical humanities, which you hear a lot right now, but it's also us who have to understand at least some basic assumptions. And really, they are also craving for these kind of debates. So I'm already saying like we and they. So that's not the point. That's the last point. Sebastian Lüttger and Jan Gerber had this talk yesterday where it's about, no, it's not about cooperation, it's about collaboration, right? It's like really a messy thing that you could do. Whatever. But, you know, it's not like building the boundaries again. Yeah.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that was interesting what you said, that of course we're constantly filtering as well, and this is something, an approach we try to establish is because we know that we are, you know, constantly filtering. That's why you see what's coming or what's happening on Contemporary End is the result of decisions all the time. Is it good enough? Does it come in? Is it, you know, and all of these questions. And what we always try to do is, while filtering, kind of you know, kind of put a mirror all around us by trying to look at our actions, if it's possible, all of the time from all angles. I know it's not possible, but this idea of seeing yourself from all angles all the time in order to, of course, it's not possible to not make any mistakes. You do mistakes all the time, but at least to double reflect why you did this, or why this doesn't come in, and why maybe we did made this decision because we come from a, I don't know, Western educated art history background, and did we do this because of this? So it's complicated. It could be, you know, we could save a lot of hours and weeks and times, but I think this extra mile is always important when it comes to our practice, because, you know, just because we do this magazine focusing on contemporary art from Africa and the diaspora doesn't mean that we know it all, and we come from, you know, from a Western perspective. So we have to reflect this, and yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, to this filtering, there is still, of course, this accumulation of knowledge and certain kind of data, which does have an effect, because if you do now Google contemporary art from Africa, for example, contemporary art comes up really high on Google, as opposed to maybe 2 or 3 years before, where you would put it in and then you have all these, you know, a naked woman sitting underneath a baobab tree or whatever, these ideas of what contemporary art from Africa is supposedly should be or is in a Western perception. So of course it depends also where you sit and where you Google, but yeah. But of course this kind of accumulation that is being filtered also has an effect in that sense of what you find, you know, with you talking about when you put something in, what comes up, that has a direct impact on that, actually, how that changes also the way how other people can then find that knowledge. So
I want to make a little small point about contemporary and is just by the very essence of its being, its existence marks another point on a map, which is exactly what Michelle was talking. For someone who's doing a bit of online research, it creates a new point on that map, which allows other people to think differently, to know that something exists that they did not know could exist. And whether it's a young, African student studying art or anybody studying art anywhere, looking into this suddenly, wow, I did not know. So by its mere existence, it's claimed a certain territory conceptually and potentially, which is very important, like just by its mere existence.
But what I find still tricky is that statistics. We're working with statistics as well, and looking or checking out who's reading us. And statistics are so problematic because, of course, they don't reflect who's really reading us. And if we have this idea, of course, our top readers sit in the US, for example, or in many African countries as well, etc. We can never find out how realistic are these statistics and really telling us who's consuming us, and do we really reach the people we want to reach, or maybe not. So this is something which is sometimes I find a bit frustrating that we don't have the tools to really find out who, that these tools aren't as transparent to really show us who are we talking to.
Yeah, the thing I find so, and I'm speaking as a humanities person, critical humanities, I find so difficult with statistics is on one level I find them fascinating. I can't stop reading them. But of course they never apply to you as an individual because they're taking a collective and, to speak crudely about it, averaging it out. So they're producing a hypothetical individual who doesn't actually exist. And of course, this is something I have to use all the time in working with students who look at the statistics about the chances of becoming a professor and they're next to nothing. And I'm like, well, people do become professors, so the statistics don't apply to you as an individual. And in many ways, that also comes back to data collection and the net, because individuals are not collectives, of course. In any given moment, you produce different collectives that you belong to depending on where and when you are and how you're performing yourself. So, sometimes I might go to a rally for Black rights, but I notice that it's, after an hour, it's a very gendered discussion, and I realize, oh, this is more about Black men and emasculation, and yes, I'm against all that, but this was supposed to be about all Black people, and over half of us here are women, and we're not being talked about at all. So suddenly I read myself as a Black woman as opposed to an oppressed African American angry at the system, and that those collective identities continuously morph. Then perhaps a little bit later, I'm a Black female academic, depending on someone said something, I'm like, oh, well, that's not true, because I just did research on it, that sort of thing. And of course, with data collection, there's more of that sense of understanding collectives as almost fixed, and you can find individuals in them all the time. They're always there, when in fact, that's not true.
Yeah. It's just like relating,
just want to bring about discussion about data collection, but also what happens afterwards. And being in a research project in which my particular topic of research is smart cities, I have been seeing some interesting takes on data ownership based on the point that it's almost impossible to think of cities without collecting data, and I guess it's only getting worse. I can't even imagine even a small village in the middle of nowhere where there is no data collection. But thinking So there is some interesting thinking about, interesting work being developed on data ownership and data that is collected in the city being claimed by the public administration for public users. But also I think it's important to envision the possibility of not only discuss the ownership but stewardship of data, because yeah, data can be used, statistics can be used, but it's interesting to understand what are the assumptions based on which those informations were collected and why. And maybe we can start also asking, so along with working with whatever data is being collected, I would also like to include other kinds of data and the decisions that are made before those data, because it's not only about picking some, some data points and choosing those ones, but also the way you design, a data collection tool is usually biased in the sense that people who are developing the technologies are not even aware of. So maybe we can start assume that data collection is not going to end, unfortunately, and we can try to put a good use, thinking of ways to promote a collective stewardship of those data and the possibilities they have. It's hard to imagine.
Because I actually wanted to bind it back to what you said about empathy, right? So in this data collection of statistics, I mean, it's hard to capture empathy. So I was thinking about how can you scale empathy. This is maybe like a hopeless, again, European perspective. But I have this kind of for some reason I have this problem about thinking about communities as this kind of starting point. Because as an Austrian, but I guess it applies to German as well, we call it Gemeinschaft, and this is always this kind of weird feeling to me, right? And I know in the North American, but also Latin American discourse, there's a different understanding. The other ones I just, because we know each other since a longer time now, it has an under kind of meaning. But from my perspective, it's really about community is always restricted, right? It's always defined by this exclusion in the beginning, and the network was actually maybe this kind of thing and chance to be potentially open, which I would more compare to society. So when I read your paper, and you actually mentioned it here also, maybe the diaspora could be this kind of interesting link, because you talk about entanglements from physics, right? This kind of that it doesn't have to be bound to this kind of community aspect, which is always bound back to who does what work what is the empathy, how is the thing. But I'm sometimes a big fan actually of scaling things and abstracting things, because I don't want to be always Diana would agree, I guess, always emotionally be involved in these kind of things, right? I'm sometimes super happy to live in a society where I go to a post office, I give the letter to the post office and it works, and I don't have to worry about these kind of things, right? So that's I guess, also one of the things how to build.
I think it's really worth pointing out some of the work, the critical work that the German sociologist Serhat Karakayali has done. And it's basically, it's in reference to looking at how well children of guest workers or minorities do in terms of higher education in Germany. And that basically compared to a Bio-Deutsch or a typical white German, they tend to do less well in higher education in terms of statistics. But once you sort of level that out and look at it in relation to class, the migrant children and people of color are overachievers. So once you sort of balance that out, not looking at it through the lens of ethnic distinctions, but rather economic distinctions, suddenly they are the overachievers. And this is something very interesting because the statistics don't look at that, right? So that's something, that's a special lens that has to be applied. And once all you have to do is add class.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways we can approach data in a more optimistic way. I also have to note, as an academic, especially as somebody who works with textual analysis, I shred things. That's what I do. I take things apart and try to find out how they work without necessarily trying to get down to a common denominator. So in many ways, I'm very different from an activist, and embarrassed at times in that I am, because I am not focused on producing necessarily or radically changing, but instead analyzing. But when it comes to data collection, I think there are two things that we can do that were actually just pointed out by all of you. And one of them is to bore down to the individuals and get produce finer and finer grained analyses, Diana, exactly as you sort of pointed out, that you look at the statistic and exactly as you said, Felipe, ask who is producing it, under what grounds were they producing it, what information did they not have, what information do we need, and then the second part is to bring in history, because usually the further and further back you go, the wider you need to go, and you begin to realize that a lot of the ways in which you're producing your knowledge in the present is not informed by as broad or deep or accurate a history as you thought.
Thank you for touching on my very next point, which is going to come back to the when, and it's like basically how time is experienced and informs what we're doing. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is, for example, what it meant to research things when you go into a library or an archive, or when you, how do you dig things out? How do you get the knowledge you get? And what that means to a sort of generation that believes everything should be available at the tap of a screen, or that it is available there. And that what they, if it's not there and if readily available within a couple of minutes, how that it ceases to exist, and it ceases to be possible to exist. You know, that's in the imaginary, and for me, that's the sort of interesting thing about what happens, is that the notion of having to work hard to find out something also disappears. So, because this is like, I mean, for me, contemporary and is something, because this is where, like, a production of art is also, like, that's an imagination machine. That's what art does, hopefully. It opens up a space where people can think something else and find out a different way to think about things they thought they knew. So I think that's why you're on this panel. So, please.
Yeah. No, just triggered a memory that this, you have to work hard to find something out, you know, and see this as a victory as well. Once you have found it, that I still remember these kind of feelings and being really euphoric, like having looked for a song, for example, and had to sing this to the guy in the record shop, you know, in order to find what I was looking for, etc. So I don't know. In terms of you know, knowledge production, or in our case, production of content from an artistic perspective, etc. Of course, in a way, coming maybe back to the idea of the network, it creates a network again on a really, I don't know, really simple, a straightforward way, in terms of that we connect people who even, I don't know, sit in one country, yeah, one continent, Africa, yeah, but many people still think it's a country, and obviously don't have anything to do with each other, still are reduced to the term of they're all producing African art, yeah, and it's all the same. Obviously, a performance artist in Nairobi does, or has nothing to do with a, I don't know, with a conceptual artist in Johannesburg, yeah, but still there's this tendency to produce this one label to reduce them, and what we rather do is try to create this network and bringing them together, even though you would have the assumption, obviously they're from Africa and they're artists, they have to know each other, but you know, these networks, the physical networks to travel within Africa is obviously, as maybe many of you know, a lot more complicated than, you know, many artists, for example, if they want to go from let's say from Joburg to Nairobi, or no, to Dakar, for example. Sometimes they have to fly over, you know, the colonial home airport, Paris, to go back to go to Senegal, for example. So these physical networks are sometimes more complicated than the very short way of us producing content and connecting people through this, and yeah.
Maybe also about the when, I guess, although we have this focus on everything that's contemporary and contemporary art production, is because we have this broad readership, and we have this readership also in Europe and the US, it is a lot about also about making a point of, because we often have this sort of moments where people behave like contemporary art from Africa just popped up 5 years ago or something. It's like, oh yes, of course, I know, you know. And so when it comes to the when, it's a lot also about making these connections going back. and having, content being produced or inviting writers or talking about feminist artists from Uganda from the 1960s, all these kind of things. And I think this is very important also kind of in having that knowledge which is then accessible and then makes these connections again to what's happening now. So,
what? Feminist artists in Uganda in the 70s? Felipe, did you want to say something?
No, I just, to bring a little back to the discussion when Clemens brought the Austrian community as a kind of restricted, and I can relate to that, I can understand that, and maybe I am also biased in thinking of the network as a kind of informal connection that is not dependent on the commonality that is part of being in a community. And it also has this aspect of bringing a weird kind of contemporary experience that keeps the shortcomings of a malfunctioning society in terms of institutions. I was just thinking of in what senses can an informal network, the kind of informal and very often weird ties we have with different people in Brazilian communities and Brazilian society, help me see time in a different way. And for instance, if my younger brother gets busted with marijuana by a cop and calls me, I won't go to the police or call my lawyer. I will call my neighbor's cousin, who is actually a policeman, and he will arrive there first. And the connection I have with that person is not based on any common view we have of the world in political or religious or social terms, but it's a bond that is there. And there is a kind of two-way exchange, and when that person needs to rely on my help on something, I will help, even though I don't agree with them in almost any aspect. So in that sense, I think I'd like to insist on that networking as a kind of para-institutional and informal and sometimes unpredictable connection is very instrumentally a tool for survival in a place where institutions cannot be relied or are not fast enough to act on whatever situation we face.
And one thing that you had mentioned earlier is that you didn't want to have empathy generated or something. And actually, unfortunately, so much of social media has, based on data collection, become like not just empathy generators, because it forces people to empathize with things they might not otherwise. It's a forced sense of affinities that are extremely destructive. And here I think I would go to a different sort of sense of time, that for example in Brazil, it looks very likely that these types of media were utilized in the disruption or creation of new affinities that really generated this kind of right-wing movement. And I think it went very quickly. And that's something, for me, it feels sometimes like time speeds up. Things go too quickly. And it's like, what was not imaginable for me 10 or 20 years ago is, Okay, maybe Clemens, maybe you would speak to that, because it's something where I think, I'm actually thinking of what the work, I know that because I know you worked a lot with Wendy, but how she's looked at this, I can't say homilies, not homilies, but not the homo communities, but the homilies. So, because I think that's a lot about what's been talked about, is how these data sets can be used to create affinities that are positive or that don't necessarily result in people murdering each other or hating each other, but just living with whatever, allowing each other to sort of live as they do. Because I think that's what Wendy is looking into a lot.
No, I'm like you. That's a problem now, because I can't speak for Wendy, right? And you mentioned before when we were back a little tiny professor, right? So that's my thing now. I'm assistant professor and I have to speak for the big shots. No, but I mean the book that I just showed about pattern recognition was actually a collaborative filtering process, if you want, so we wrote it together. And the discussions about homophily came actually out from reading this paper by Lazarsfeld and Merton from 50s, 60s even, which are about neighborhoods discrimination, but also segmentation, right? And it's the idea is, especially it's a paper about two sociologists, very important ones, to think about how segmentation actually happens or had happened at that time in the US. And the interesting thing is that they come up with two kind of like forces or vectors. On the one side, it's the homophily aspect, so that you want to be around by your peers or by people who are like you. That's like in English, it would be like birds of a feather flock together. But what it's like completely omitted is that in the same paper, they talk about heterophily as the other vector, which is important. This is, I guess, what I want to hint at, that you cannot more and more homogenize, right? It's about, even like a community, as I see maybe society, needs this kind of other vector as well. And the interesting thing, this paper became one of the founding, or at least like one of the central papers behind network analysis. So it's one of the most cited papers in network analysis, but maybe one of the less read papers, or like maybe not even read at all, right? Because they only take one aspect, homophily. And if you think a little bit about this, and we had the discussion while writing this book, if you think about this, think about any recommendation system we're using right now. That the assumption is always you want to be in the neighborhood, want to be something that is like you in this kind of thing. And it makes sense at some point, right? Because you need this kind of recommendations which people are close to you, you think your friends, your neighbors and so on, this makes sense. But on the other side, this is why we get stuck in filter bubbles all the time, because I mean, you can only take this to a specific level, right? And now, the counter argument is, and this is like what I'm a little bit by critical humanities, I'm a little bit, not disappointed, but I see potential, let's say that. These things are biased, we know that. We know these are problems, right? And there are a lot of books about this, but what is the next step? How can you actually really build heterophilistic search engines? That's a mess at some point. Because if you only get results you don't want to see, you really get paranoid at some point. It's really like one of those things, you need some kind of patterns or similarity or what it is. And there are many different ways to do this. Maybe this last thing, because you mentioned that this network, again, network analysis really this kind of being the engine behind most of these platform recommendation systems that we have. In the PhD workshops we had in the last 2 days, Rodrigo actually shows some kind of tactical intervention, and he can blame me now, but I hope I got it right. But he took like the Last.fm database, so we're talking about music again, which is built on this principle that you always want to be in a similarity, right? It's still like a content-based approach, but it can be also collaborative, doesn't really matter. And you use proxies, and the proxies are usually European or North American, right? You know this. You can get to something, but you always go via proxy. Network analysis, we call these hubs. Google is a hub and these kind of things. But you can actually turn it around easily and say the hub becomes the proxy. And all of a sudden you get these connections with, I mean, I'm just like thinking in that sense, within a musician from Uganda and somebody from Ghana, for example, right? If you use the same kind of logic behind the network, but you just tactically intervene there.
Wonderful. I just got the idea we need to uncommon things. We need to stop commoning and start uncommoning. Now we have a very small amount of time for questions from the public. So it's very hard for me to see. Yes, they're going to raise the lights. There are people wearing orange T-shirts. They have microphones. Please give a sign. I will collect a few questions if they are out there. You need to let me know if you have a question because we can barely see you. Question or a comment. Would ask you to keep them very short, to the point, and directed at one of the speakers or in general. Like, let us know who you're asking the question to. I see no questions. Okay, good. So. Okay. Okay, Željko, you're going to need to get a microphone. So let's, like, one of the orange-shirted people, please. Oh, okay. That's.
I'm curious, how do you feel critique that we practice here in the context of transmediale and kind of as cultural practitioners, as academics, as maybe activists, embodied in actual cultural field. Like all the discussions I've heard so far were really discussing industry, sometimes specific cultural projects, but not really cultural institutions that we take part in, and then events that we take part in, like transmediale is. I think there was a little bit about tactical media scene and next 5 minutes, but we don't really self-reflect in how much we embody these practices more critically. Like, do we also just look at people like us when we come to transmediale? Do we also...
Wait, Željko, your question is going too long. You're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay. Do we also... Okay, was I clear or was I too long to speak?
I mean, maybe we didn't say it, but of course, I mean, events like Transmediale or others, it's often that we end a workshop saying like we're preaching to the converted. So that we say a lot of things that those people that attend the workshop already somehow have a notion of, or that's why they otherwise wouldn't have come, you know, or wouldn't have come to the symposium and so on. So I think this is, of course, a very important aspect. But I also felt like, at least like with the workshops and things and the students that we met so far, for example, Transmediale, I think most of them are very aware of that, actually, where they are and how they're moving and how they're actually perceiving certain content. And it was actually in the discussions we had on Wednesday, for example, like a big question how to step out of that. We didn't find the solution, I'm sorry, I can't give that answer, but it was definitely a big issue to think about that in a sense of not literally out how to be open to other networks and things, but also how to step out of the sphere, which is kind of a bubble, and make something that is has a relevance that goes beyond gatherings like this, for sure.
Step out of the critique. Huh? That's what they said. Step out of the critique, and what's the opposite? So going out, do something. So that was a bit of the dilemma of the students, because they're obviously in the middle of an academic process and questioning themselves, where do I, you know, what is my part in changing the world, you know, continuing reading all of that stuff, so where? Yeah.
Clemens?
But maybe just quickly on this, as far as I understood, you're also using this kind of institutions, right, as strategic base. So, like, what was always like striking me is, so I'm coming from this kind of 90s critical net cultures background. In the 90s, it's like a generation between this generation before. You see the next 5 minutes, they had infrastructure, they really had a strategic position, but we're talking all the time about tactical interventions. This is a very interesting thing. So it was about, you have your grounds, but you hit and run into another direction, right? So the discourse was about tactics, but I think the politics was about strategy, and nowadays it's the other way around. We don't have any kind of strategy, or less. Transmediale would be like one of the few festivals. In the 90s there were a lot of these festivals, right? But there's no strategic ground anymore. So we have this tactical maneuvering we always have to adopt in these kind of things. But the discourse right now is all about strategies. You know what I mean? It's even in the art discourse, but also especially like in, let's say, critical humanities or how to build new networks. It's always about the big scale, right? Material networks, undersea cables, and these kind of things. I find this very fascinating that this just like, you know, shifted within 20 years.
Yeah, just quickly, I think from the top of my head I could list the names of at least 20 people who have worked in the recent past that have nothing to do with anything here. They are very far from here. It pains me not to be there with those people right now, because the current situation in Brazil has, in a sense, required myself and my family to spend some time abroad just in order to keep on going. But I would like to return there one day and, you know, get back to doing things that I agree when you kind of embody whatever you're preaching, things acquire a lot of meaning. But yeah, I don't see myself as kind of being in a context right now in which we're just, you know, discussing an abstract possibility of changing the world. I really have been involved with things that I'm proud of, and I would like to get back to them as soon as possible, but there is this kind of time that I have to spend abroad.
But I think we're slowly going to have to close down, and I think in a way that's a good way to look at the wheres and whens. I mean, I'm always up for the whys as well, but okay. Because time, the way that time and space sort of collide, and you do what you can do, where and how, and I think based on what resources you have, and I think this is one of the sort of more, optimistic things, is that we do have some tools that allow us to have a voice, to take a place, to claim, to stake a claim, not just on the internet, but on a body of knowledge. I mean, I'm going back to contemporary and, because it's really it's an incredible, because it's not a symbolic gesture, it's a real thing that also has an incredible symbolic value and potential. And that's something, for me, it's this resonance of what it means to simply to say, I exist, and claim that space, in a space that did not recognize and had worked very actively to erase your existence. Because when you were going back to why people don't know this or that, why this Hegel didn't know this, or what Marx didn't know, this kind of active ignorance, right? That they are actively embracing their own ignorance about the world. And this is something which, those are erasures. They're not, it's not blind spots, it's more of the erasures. And you see that more and more in sort of heteronormative, dominant, patriarchal society, that it erases all of those counter narratives, counter histories, counter potentials that would defy its own strength. And I think this is where the sort of possibility of alternative networks that connect across time and space could create and generate some types of, I'm going to go with something hippie, holistic energies that could be a force for good. And yeah, I think that might be where we end it. So unless, if you guys want to have some forces for it back. Oh, really? Okay, good. Okay, so they're okay, you know what? You're going to have to go somewhere near a microphone. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear, but it's going to, yeah. So.
Hey there. Thanks for the...
Oh, is that Matteo?
Yes, hi. Hi, Diana. I just wanted to somehow connect this also to the very inspiring talk that we had yesterday about archives, digital archives, and the fact that isn't maybe archive in the a digital archive also a way to kind of, and collecting and navigating through an archive, a way to somehow establish a different temporality as well, and to kind of to also create the skills about how you navigate through the past of a certain network, of a certain network reality, and you collect all these different moments in it, and you maybe filter them out in a certain way, and therefore create a new narrative, and see that there are then different ways, and how that then does kind of somehow work in the present moment, right? So if you take some digital content that might otherwise been lost in the deluge of files and things that we have on our hard drives and are available on the internet, and you see how that actually really kind of works or is actual today in a certain discourse, in a certain political or artistic discourse or practice. How, I believe, how...
Wait, I think if we want to have time to answer, because now I think that's
that's enough.
Because basically our archives, one of the potentials is somehow what you could be asking. I'm going to shorten it to that.
I guess that's what we, for example, but a lot of other platforms, that's exactly what we do in a sense, and that's the idea behind it. It's always about the temporality of being in the now, of featuring actual content, of having names and narratives that are known to certain people and are not known to others. And I mean, we've been in existence for 7 years now, so it is a huge archive that has been building up with a lot of narratives and debates. I think that started through that archive that have not even been there before. So I think the archive can also, or should be also really seen not only as this kind of passive space that just collects, but also as an activation space that can actually, as an archive, activate a new narrative that becomes then relevant beyond that archive. Because I think this is really what happens with platforms like ours, that it is, or we see it as that it is two things at the same time, and therefore also these different temporalities can come together in it.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are going to have to close this now because, the time is the time, and we are dealing with the time we're dealing with. So let's hope these have opened up some new politics of possibilities, and I want to thank again Michelle M. Wright, Clemens Apprich, Contemporary And with Yvette Mutumba and Julia Gross, and of course, Felipe Fonseca.
Can I put this on?
So thank you all, and I hope that you've gotten some things to think about, and see you at the next panel.
I wanted to thank you as well. Just 1 second. Thank you so much for opening the symposium. This was really amazing. I'm not going to offer any pretentious closing words. I'm going to say the cliché that is often critiqued at events like this. Please continue the conversation outside. I know for my sake, my stomach is grumbling, and you were very patient for this very long morning session. I want to say at 2, we continue in here with a performance lecture by Olia Lialina. There's already other programs such as the Research Networks, PhD workshop, panel running in the Roter Salon, and the Schmugel, perhaps an interesting example of a heterophilistic search engine in our lounge that you can also check out. So please, thank you again. See you later.